Welcome to the Neophytes of Narratology, the internet's most pretentious and pseudo-intellectual pursuit since, perhaps, Nietzsche's thus podcast Zarathustra, or Camus' renowned Vlog of Sisyphus. While lesser men aspire to stand on the shoulders of mere giants, we at the Lost Signals will accept nothing less than titans. So join us as we delve into the fundamentals of narrative nuance and critique the critics who proclaim to know the universal qualities of effective storytelling.
Hello, and welcome back to Neophytes of Narratology. We're starting a special series on TED Talks. These are going to be short little various storytellers and the TED Talks that they have given. I'm Steve-O, as always, to steal Scott's line, and here with Scott Thurlow.
The worst storytellers rip off from better storytellers.
And Ian Manzer.
I swore no songs for this, so...
So our first TED Talks little vignette here is going to be about a talk that Andrew Stanton gave. And he is a scriptwriter that worked for Pixar. He also did John Carter, which I don't know if I...
In retrospect,
yeah,
he
started off with that.
some credit from him.
I was like, maybe not as good, but he actually gave a pretty good talk, I think.
Yeah, he did Toy Story, he did Finding Nemo,
Wall-E.
So he had all these modern
He's got
cartoon
legit
classics.
enough cred, we'll say, sure.
Except for John Carter.
And
Legit enough.
yeah, so he kind of gives a whole bunch of kind of guidelines for how to tell a story, several of which were... I'll just go through them really quickly, and then we can break them down and talk about them. So he had the unifying theory of 2 + 2, which was kind of you need to give the reader or give the watcher, the viewer, everything that they need to, finish the story themselves, but not actually tell them what they should be, getting out of it.
I took it as a rephrase of show, not tell, more or less, broadly.
Right. He had a quote in there that said that drama is a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. Mm-hmm. He had a theory about, he had a theory that he got from someone else, actually, about the spine of a good character. I guess a main character is kind of the itch that they need to scratch.
It's their one overarching motivation.
Yeah, the idea that storytelling is a joke, in the sense that you need to have a punchline in mind to really drive the point home at the end. Yeah, and then just kind of the overall idea that storytelling is a list of guidelines that you kind of make and stick to as you're going through writing the story.
And then a bunch of personal anecdotes.
So, I don't know, are any of these ones that you guys want to start with?
Well, I'll pick out the thing that I found the most interesting that he incorporated into his speech was that he said, any good story has an override or a theme that is always weaved through it, that's interwoven throughout it. And I think I sort of gravitate towards that point. I think I agree with it 100%, that it's... Sometimes it's, in a bad story, of course, if it's not addressed well or made clear to you, it's going to be a bad story. Right. And that's something personally, to me at least, that when I myself and some of us here were attempting to be writers on that scale, that I think that was the most important thing. I tried to focus on that, and I'm really glad I was appreciative that he made that one of his points of him going into making a good story.
Well, to kind of, I don't know if this is the same one, but the spine with that overarching theme.
It's sort of like a sub thing of that. Yeah, I agree with that.
I believe he got it from an acting class, actually.
Yes, he did.
So I believe this is an attempt to show that even if you're given a one-dimensional character, you can develop a two-dimensional. Like, he's arguing for the importance of two-dimensional characters here, which,
sure,
I don't know if that's a necessary point to have to drive home in a TED Talk, but I don't know, it was effective for how he delivered it.
Or even three-dimensional characters, if you will. Like taking the underlying meaning that your character embodies and kind of pushing it to the next level, I think, is the big part of that. And figuring out what your character wants is one of the most important things of
sure, like I said,
motivations.
It's providing a psychological motivation for why it's not just that my character wants to do this for X, Y, and Z purposes, but what is the thing that drove that character to pursue X, Y, and Z? And
Yes.
yeah, it's very. To me, it's like a obvious point, but perhaps it's not for.
Sure, maybe not to the
every
layman,
single-
though. But
Yeah.
either way.
So I kind of go back and forth whenever I read anything about writing. There's a lot of times where I think the same thing, like, oh yeah, this is obvious. But I think the more that people who teach storytelling drive it home and give nuance to those kind of obvious things, the more it kind of gets under your skin as a writer or an actor or like whatever creative thing you're trying to do. Having someone reinforce that, and maybe, and in the best examples of it, giving a different vision of that, kind of making me as like a hopeful creator or whatever, somebody that's trying to do something or learn something about the craft, giving me another spin on it really helps.
Sure, yeah, it's like your own like interpretation, but nevertheless, as you said and as he said, that there were guidelines to storytelling, but not hard and fast rules, which I think I also like that quote a lot. I think it's very much true. Again, maybe it seems obvious, but you sort of have to point it out in order to show those who are maybe not as immersed in storytelling, if you will, in quotes, as we might be and as he is.
I disagree completely with that guidelines rule.
Yeah,
because I believe there are steadfast rules to narrative. I'm a student of Aristotle in that respect, and that the guidelines come in that you can create your own guidelines, because once you know the rules, you can subvert them.
Yeah, that's true. That's something we said before, and
that's why I understand what he's saying. That attempting to he goes on about when he's developing Toy Story, about trying to break off from a lot of the cliches that have been plaguing
the classic
like the Disney
conventions
films up until that point. But all of those conventions, like, there had to have been rules for it to be innovative. To break from that, but still retain a core, that spine, and a different sort of narrative.
I get it. I don't disagree with you on that point. I think it's maybe more loose than you might think it is, or at least you seem to subscribe to. But nevertheless, I agree there must be some kind of foundation, and then so you can mess with that foundation.
Yeah.
But like how hard and fast, how rigid that foundation is, may not be necessarily set in stone, if you will.
Yeah, I think.
But nevertheless, I think it's a good point, broadly applied to storytelling.
I think there have been a lot of good stories that have completely broken convention. But you're right. I think that you have to know what the conventions are.
There has to be conventions, of course, in order to break them.
You have to know what the conventions are to break them, and especially to do it. You need to know what they are really well to break them really well, I think. And because you have to know what you're actually doing, you have to know what you're actually doing to the audience. So you have to know what that convention is doing to the audience, and then you have to know however you subvert it is going to do as well.
But
sure.
There has to be an element to that. So there's the idea of the suspension of disbelief that audiences are willing to take. And I'm going to use his own works here. With Toy Story, your first and foremost suspension of disbelief comes with the fact that toys are alive when you're not looking at them, and that there are rules to the toys in order to sell this new reality to the audience.
Sure, it's world building, essentially.
But you can't then add in a greater twist to that, because once there's a certain level of acceptance that the audience has, and I think that yes, there are the guidelines he has, but there's still that narrative foundation that you have to attach yourself to.
Well, I think what he's saying is that in any story you have to establish your own rules, whatever rules you want to make it. So it's not that you don't have any rules, and I think that him saying in the talk that you should have guidelines as opposed to rules. I don't know if he says exactly like that, but that's basically the gist.
I think it's pretty close to what he said, as I recall.
I think that's maybe throws off what his real point is. And I think his real point is that in your own story, you have to establish your own rules. And once those rules are established, you can't break them. You can't, completely change the rule. In Toy Story, you can't completely change the rules of how toys work. Just as a very simple one, like when the kid walks into the room, all the toys go limp and just pretend that they're not alive. And that's kind of, but actually that's funny because they do break that eventually in the Toy Story series. Maybe in the first one.
First one.
Yeah.
Actually.
Sure. But no, I mean, it goes back. This is something we said on various casts of ours, mostly in Mott's and so forth. any work has to establish its own rules and play by them. And if you don't do that enough, then it becomes like an unintelligible story, right? I know, Ian, you're definitely a big fan of saying that. Like, it's sort of some of the questions we've answered on our own scale were dependent upon whether or not a story did that. And when they don't, then it becomes convoluted,
Yeah, of course.
to say the least. So, no, I mean, agree with
to
all
build
that.
off your own framework.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, you can have whatever framework you want as long as you stick by it, by and large. I think was his point about that, at least.
Again, well, my last point on this is just a reiteration of my full point. I feel that there's a stronger set of rules to narrative than I believe he does, which is perfectly fine, and you two do as well. So, I think, but I did want to bring up the 2+2 rule, which I thought was very interesting. That the idea of,
I like that one too.
You need to make your audience work, but you can't let them know you're working.
Trick them into doing the work.
That's actually, I think, the most important part of it. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but I wanted to emphasize.
There's I'm going to go off to video games for a second, which is the idea of having control over your work,
player agency,
but giving the illusion of control. And this is and his point is sort of a switch of that, which is still having control, still making the point, but playing with what the audience is willing to do. And I think that's a fascinating. I would like to actually. I wish the TED Talk was more on that point.
No, I agree with that, and I think tied into that, he brought up shortly thereafter he said something about if you create a sense of wonder in your audience, that you can't force that. Like, there's no way to or inorganically have that emotion in any audience. So a well done story will do that, and video games will be the same thing. Sure, they're just different ways of telling a story. But I think that kind of got to me too. I was like, you're right. Like, when you read something or any story you encounter in any medium, if it does something to you that you're not expecting, and it just creates like that pure sense, there's innocence to it. I think he also said, if you can achieve that, then that's very effective storytelling.
Yeah, and
it goes back to what Ian was saying and Andrew's point about giving them the 2+2. You can't just give them 4. You have to give like little hints, but just enough that they have enough to put it together, and they're doing the work without knowing it.
Right. If I may be a little bit give the more cynical version of this, you have to make the audience feel smart, but you can't make them feel dumb.
Yes, You're right. No, that's perfectly well said. I like that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I thought that was, again, that was a very interesting thing. It's kind of, you want to make all the disparate parts of your story make sense together, but you don't want to necessarily put them all side by side on the other side of the equation, You want to leave your audience thinking about it. If any story that's done really well, I think, does that.
At least in theory.
You leave your audience thinking about it, trying to put the pieces together themselves a little bit. And you don't just hammer home whatever point you're trying to make. You kind of let it germinate within the audience.
Yeah, like I said, and that also goes back to what I was just saying about that will create a sense of wonder if you're able to do that.
Yeah.
Then it achieves all of those goals within storytelling.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So there's this. I don't mean to disparage Andrew Stanton here, but he brought up the Godfather in this.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems really funny to me. And again, I guess this is my own prejudice here, but he's talking about Toy Story and Finding Nemo and WALL-E, which are great films. But it's just like, I feel like it's a person at a lower level talking about storytelling and referencing works that are out of that league. And again, I don't mean to disparage him because I think he's a master of his craft. But I couldn't help but think that throughout. Like, why are you telling me about storytelling? It's weird. I don't know.
Maripuzio is not going to do it. So
maybe not. No, I get what you mean, but it's not that he said Godfather was bad. He was just using it as an example of character.
No. He's saying that he loved Godfather, but
it's like someone. It's sort of like a director of.
I see what you mean, though.
Like an episode of Barney talking about how like whether Martin Scorsese is a good director or not. I don't know. It's just
you're saying he's not quite qualified to speak upon that.
But I don't think that's
I
don't think that's true. I can't help but have that like thought in my head during this.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, I certainly see your point on that, but I don't think it invalidates in any way anything he did say. And I found myself agreeing with 99% of everything he did say of the fundamentals and the format and the structures, etc., of what goes into effective storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I go into all these. I don't know if anybody else has anything to say about his finer points within here. I was gonna kind of do a roundup of kind of my ideas about this, but I think that the important thing about listening to people talking about storytelling is that everybody, and he did mention this also, actually, everybody has a story to tell. And I think everybody that has told a story has something to teach anybody who's trying to write a story. Anybody who's told a good story has something to teach anybody who's trying to write a story. Maybe you're not trying to write that type of story, but you can certainly learn something from their successes and even failures. You know, those are the most interesting things sometimes, is going back and looking at somebody's failure and what they're willing to admit about what failed for them and what they don't think worked. And you can kind of look at that and say, all right, well, here's why it didn't work in my mind.
No, he said that. He said, like, you know, when I was early on starting out, I would exchange ideas and so forth of other people who are trying to do the same thing, of, like you just said, what works and what doesn't, and what's effective and what kind sort of may fall flat, even though it seems like a good idea, quote unquote, on paper, if you will.
I don't know if you have anything to add there, Ian, but
no, I enjoyed this talk very much. This, of course, is a subject that we are personally interested in, and are sort of, reviewing the reviewer kind of. But no, I think this was the first of 6, so
yeah. So we'll be back.
It's a very good lead off as well. It was a good introduction to again the structure of storytelling, I suppose.
Those who can't do teach. Those who can't do or teach critique. So here we are. Yep. Again, I apologize for that. It just I enjoyed a lot of what he said, although I don't.
Sorry, go ahead.
I think, aside from the 2+2 unifying theory of 2+2, a lot of what he said I thought was kind of obvious points.
Yeah, you're like,
there.
I know that, sure, but because you have we've studied this.
So
already.
I don't know. I'm interested to see what the others have, and perhaps if I will have a better view on this if others are equal or less than.
Sure. Well, let me sum up my final closing is that this was like storytelling 101 if it were a course, right? So it's sort of just a broad overview, and it gave you the structure that you would need to tell more intricate stories. So without this, you can't expand, I would say. Yep. So that's why I say it was a good little introduction.
But if you're listening to a podcast on narratology, I think this is one you might probably skip.
Sure. Yeah.
I don't know.
I somewhat see what you mean.
I take I took something from it, as I try to take something from like any.
As you just said, he himself
anything.
says.
Yeah.
Sure.
So I don't know. I think that we'll see how the rest of them are, but I think that it's kind of interesting to hear a range of people talk about writing. Yeah, this wasn't super in depth about the writing process or anything like that, but in a 20-minute talk, I don't know if you're going to be able to be. You kind of just have to go over the broad strokes of what you want people to get more into, I think, and like let them put 2 and 2 together themselves.
Sure, like I said, it's storytelling for the LCD.
I think you presented for the entire time.
So. That's fine,
maybe,
but it was still valid as all.
Yeah,
that's all I can say. It was a decent talk and a good lead off, at least for this series.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I liked it. Anyway, I think we're all set here. So I'm going to sign off. I'm here. I've been joined by Jonathan Ian Manzer to my left.
Goodbye.
And straight across the table from me, Scott Thurlow.
2+2 equals 4 in stories.
And I'm Steve-O, and have a good night.
This has been the Neophytes of Narratology. We hope that you've experienced an epiphany or two of the literary nature, but only metaphorically, of course. Music by Christopher Morgan, editing and engineering by Jonathan Ian Manzer.